Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We will share the floor. I will begin, and David will intervene after me. As there have been a lot of things which has been said all along the previous day, our presentation will not present a really new thing, but essentially trying to give our view on how to order the various consideration which has been developed in the previous day. Our title is Accessibility, a Universal Tool. And our general idea, is that accessibility is maybe a key indicator, but is also, in the present state of the knowledge, essentially a tool for appraisal. Our point of view will be a point of view of practitioner and economist. There is no real brand new result in what we'll present, which is based on two working papers we are now in progress with the World Bank about accessibility. The first point I would address is that accessibility has an important role, is widely used all over our countries. This point has been developed in. I skip a lot of slides because we had make our presentation for 40 minutes, but we asked to compress it in 15 or 20 minutes. In fact, in every of our country, there are a lot of statistics and use of indicators. I would, for instance, dwell and pay tribute to the World Bank, which currently use two indicators, a Rural Accessibility Index and an Air Connectivity Index, which are really akin to accessibility indicators. And they are mainly used for strategic purpose as element for choosing project, but all over the world, indicators accessibility are used in a rather fuzzy manner, not really ordered. And our idea is to suggest an order, a queue to use accessibility based on economic analysis. And I would then come back to the theoretical basis of accessibility. It is well known in the case of transport. I will not dwell on it because it has been developed through the multinomial logit models, the random utility models, and which happens to come to the log sum. I would also mention, I will not develop the equation and the result. I would also mention that, and it leads to the double constraint model, which has been quoted yesterday in traffic modeling. I would also say a word on the use of accessibility in another stream of idea, in another tradition, which is the trade tradition. There is a lot of a field of trade, of use of accessibility and gravity model in the trade tradition, coming from the Armington model and developed by Anderson and Van Winkop, which is widely used both in trade and also in economic geography. And it's quite striking that in both fields we arrive with slightly different assumption, we arrive to a very similar formulation. Trade, I have put here in this slide, so two lines, the trade flow, traffic tradition on the left, with the general double constraint model, and the trade modeling in the right part of this slide. And it is important to see that the trade tradition gives you an indication of what another factor which could be important, which is important, is the price at the nodes. In the trade and economic geography tradition, accessibility implies not only the masses, let us say the revenue of at each node, and the cost, transport cost between nodes, but also the price level at each node, which is an indication on how easy will be the export or the import from the present node, from the node where we are to the node where we need to export. It is what can be called the augmented accessibility, which is quite similar to the double constraint model in transport, which is not much used in transport. The double constraint is not much used, but the augmented accessibility, which takes into account several constraints, is used in transport, in the trade and economic geography tradition. And also in new economic geography. If you look at from the economic point of view, you see that there are two possible uses of accessibility in this vein, which is normative and positive. I will develop the normative use of accessibility. We have soft normative use that we have seen a lot yesterday. But I will dwell mainly on what I would call the hard normative view, which is the use of accessibility as a consumer surplus through the lump sum, the well-known lump sum formula. In trade, we have similar results, which I'll not develop. Sees accessibility as a measure of welfare is limited by several drawbacks. Consumer surplus is only valid when you have mainly no externalities and no increasing return to scale. But as far as you take into account economic geography, you are induced, you cannot escape from taking into account externality and increasing return to scale, which are the basis of agglomeration and of the general economic geography development, especially new economic geography, but not only. And I would illustrate this contradiction with a small focus on a big project we are now trying to implement in Paris, which is the Grand Paris Express, which is it is not, you cannot, when you put here, it's good, but when you put on here, on the,
this kind of screen, it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. Yes, yes. So it's a double ring around Paris, which is a very large project, 200 kilometers, almost the same size as the existing metro network, and which should be implemented within the 10 future years. We had to evaluate it, and it was quite clear that to evaluate it, it was not sufficient to take into account transport effect. because this project, this very large project, this program, has as objective to improve transportation, of course, but also it's also a part of a plan to revitalize the agglomeration Île-de-France. It is to foster economic growth of the region. To improve, this plan would imply improving the housing market, alleviate the geographical mismatch, fight against the urban sprawl in concentrating the new location all around this ring. And it was quite clear that this project did not imply just transport consequences, but has much more large objectives. And we were obliged, in order to appraise it, not only to take into account the usual transport effect, consumer surplus, which was not assessed through a lump sum, unfortunately, but it's due to the fact that the transport model was not a multimodal logic model. But in fact, lump sum could take into account all transport attributes. You can introduce cost, time, reliability, any important impact. And so we used, it's not quite clear, but you see that the three first line represent the benefit, classical transport benefit, and we had to, we also tried to assess the other type of benefit, which are environmental and urban benefit, and also effect on the productivity of firms, the external agglomeration, externality, and also the effect of employment. And we arrive at the result that shows also the external effect external to transport amount to not far from half the benefit of the project. So it clear appeared to us that positive use of accessibility should be supplemented by other adds up coming from the positive use of accessibility.
Good morning. I will talk now about the positive uses of accessibility and the problems of transferring, or problems perhaps also of relevance between theory and practice. First of all, accessibility, as you know, is a major indicator for the location of firms and households. But it's not so simple. It's the general meaning mechanisms. But behind this, you have sometimes intuitive polarization effects. Sometimes it's really counterintuitive. So there's a kind of complexity that makes it difficult to to give clear messages to decision makers. Anyways, accessibility is a key factor in several fields. We have mentioned here agglomeration externalities, the wedge equations also, and location effects as a whole. When activities are close, production is more efficient. You know about the usual sources that are quoted for explaining this: the matching, learning, sharing, etc. What is important is that in the last years, econometric analysis has been quite able to sort out what was really linked to, in fact, the density effect on productivity. We think that now we have some kind of elasticities that are rather robust. But it raises many questions. First of all, which kind of factor do you use for representing density? We have talked yesterday about effective density versus real density, for instance, and also the problem of possible double counting, always present. And another issue was raised yesterday. It was the distributive issue. And here, well, what is the final effect once changes in locations and so on have been achieved? And can we define this final outcome? Is there a kind of final distribution? Or should we perhaps look at a kind of trajectory, whereas some people or some places do benefit of a project during certain length of time, etc.? Maybe it could give us a kind of history to tell the decision makers that could have some meaning for them. Well, here I will skip these two slides and just give some practical examples of positive uses. Well, I've taken two of them. First one is at the national level, because we spoke also about the different scales yesterday. So this was, in fact, an assessment of a general scheme for transport infrastructure in France. It was made about 8 years ago, and we ended up in showing some pictures that gave an idea of distribution of accessibility by rail for all the by then 23 metropolitan regions in France. So it is, well, you cannot see it very clearly here, but it's kind of spider web diagram where you have a present situation, the counterfactual then, and then the new scheme that was to be appraised. And so every region can compare itself to the other ones and see how the project, here it was a program, would impact its own situation. In fact, territories and elected officials like to have some kind of benchmark. Really, it rings something for them. And the second illustration is, in fact, we plotted on the x-axis, we have initial real accessibility of the regions, and on the y-axis, we have the relative increase of this accessibility. So as you can see, the red dots are the counterfactual. Well, it already improved real accessibility, and you can see the dotted real line. It indicates that there was a kind of redistributive action of this counterfactual scheme, because the more the regions had a good accessibility, the less they would increase it proportionally. And it can be shown also, it's easy to see that for the blue dots, which represent in fact the scheme to be assessed, well, the redistribution effect was higher. So it was good news, and it could be represented with really simple graphical presentations. So just another example, a concrete example, it's at the local level this time, and it's about harbor accessibility. Well, we've heard about Rouen lately, but not for so good news. Here it's from we have a great harbor in Rouen, and in fact this picture represents in fact the isochrones, which have really important economic and commercial meaning for the clients of the harbor. It's the first white line represents the limit where trucks can load in or load in the port and then go back within the same day. And the second one, further one, is the destinations that can be reached within 1 day of trekking. So it has also meaning for the elected officials, because it's kind of a, how would you say, a kind of influence radius their town or their region has. So it's very meaningful for them. So we'll stop on these concrete examples and just go to comparisons, going back to comparisons of transport, trade, and new economic geography, as Emile already introduced. Well, four-step models and transport models usually focus on the impact of costs between two nodes, and they are concerned with modal shares and traffic. Trade models, on the contrary, are concerned with pure monetary flows. That's all they matter. New economic geography has a broader view because, well, even though the size of costs is important, they are really concerned by the distributive issues. And then it seems that NEG could be more attractive for the territories and elected officials. But anyway, the problem is that it's perhaps not so easy, and there's a relationship between those three fields and the scales we spoke of. Usually four-step models are at a micro scale. It's really at a project scale. It's focused on transport. Trade models are at a very macro scale, and NEG is in between. The problem is that NEG tools are not really user-friendly, and it's difficult also to explain. There's, I think, a great problem for getting clear messages out of all the theoretical package that has been developed during the last 10 or 20 years. So from a public policy point of view, well, in fact, local decision makers are rather concerned not really by the costs of linking one node to another. It's not really their central concern. As elected officials, they are much more concerned by what happens in the nodes. It means the potentials that we have. It might be a location. It might be a population, jobs, shops, etc. And their questions are: well, should I invest in a new facility in location I, or should I regroup all small facilities in one concentrated place within my territory? Well, where should I locate new housing? So these questions imply transport issues, but they are not explained, and they are not asked from the transport point of view. So also territories and elected officials are really looking for attractiveness of their territories. Well, what does this relate to? It may again relate to the potential they offer as shops, the attractiveness for households searching a new location, etc. Perhaps they could have some interest for accessibility indexes, as I showed the example at the national level, because it brings something as regards the competition between territories. And for instance, some small cities, well, they say, okay, I don't have much population, many shops and so on, but I'm close to a big city and this is a competitive advantage. It's not so sure. This is why I keep advantage like this. But anyways, there's always a kind of competition issue, or sometimes even of survival or of territories. They really feel like this for some territories. So just to finish in a few slides, Well, we may think about transversal uses of accessibility, because this kind of accessibility indexes may offer a simple tool, but also it's not really, as we saw, a kind of normative tool. It may, at first, give some basic words that could be common between fields of public action, in between transport, on the one hand, and between urbanism or education, for instance, where should we put the schools and so on. It offers a basis for the possible progressive development of a shared evaluation framework, and anyways to discuss on a more strategic level the question of strategic investments. I think the new element here is that then people can share common concerns and see, for instance, that even though they think in education terms, transport is also at stake and may be very important also for them. And all this, well, in fact, could begin by some informed ex post analysis, and perhaps in that a long time gone with more prospective issues. I will skip this example just to get to my conclusion, to our conclusion, sorry. Here, okay. Okay, so we could try, in fact, to improve the link between research and decision makers through a program allowing to use accessibility as a proxy for, well, a rough proxy for giving hits about the impacts of some projects or public measures, and give perhaps some indicative orders of magnitude. The spread would be also quite interesting. And of course it would be much less accurate than what theory can presently give, but maybe it would be more easy to understand for decision makers, less data demanding. We spoke about the problem of well, engineering capacity in the territories, etc. And in fact, estimated this magnitude could in fact have having some beginnings of discussions, and then maybe a long time it would be easier to transfer some theoretical messages once you get used to the basic words. It's, as we said, someone said yesterday, maybe it was Phil, people, transport planners are very much used to four-step models, etc. It seems easy, simple for them, but it's complex, in fact. But the issue is perhaps to get little by little people to this complexity, but without trying to make the very, very big step that is needed. We perhaps should begin by small steps. Thanks.
Well,